Let's talk the way I would if you'd just shown me a blood sugar log that concerned you a little, and you were sitting across from me asking what you could actually do about it, starting today, without waiting for your next appointment. Here's something that surprises almost every patient I explain this to. The order you eat your food in, not just what you eat or even how much, can meaningfully change your blood sugar response to the exact same meal. Same plate, same calories, same macronutrients, different result, based purely on sequence. Let me walk you through why this happens the way I would in an actual consultation. When you eat carbohydrates, particularly refined ones, on an empty stomach, glucose from that food gets absorbed into your bloodstream relatively quickly, causing a sharp rise in blood sugar. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin to bring that level back down. If that rise was sharp and large, the corresponding insulin response tends to be large too. And this pattern, repeated meal after meal, day after day, contributes over time to a phenomenon called insulin resistance, where your cells become progressively less responsive to insulin's signal, requiring even more insulin to manage the same amount of glucose. Here's what I want you to understand about eating order specifically. If you eat vegetables and protein before you eat the carbohydrate portion of your meal, even by just a few minutes, several things happen that meaningfully blunt this entire spike. Let me explain the mechanism properly, step by step, the way I'd want you to actually understand it, not just follow blindly. First, fiber from vegetables, eaten first, begins forming a gel-like layer along your stomach and intestinal lining. When carbohydrates arrive afterward, this fiber physically slows their absorption into your bloodstream, spreading that glucose entry out over a longer period rather than delivering it all at once. Second, protein eaten before carbohydrates triggers release of specific gut hormones, including one called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, which slows gastric emptying. The rate at which food moves from your stomach into your small intestine, where the majority of glucose absorption actually occurs. Slower gastric emptying means a slower, more gradual rise in blood glucose from whatever carbohydrate follows. Third, and this is genuinely fascinating research, some studies using continuous glucose monitors have shown that this same GLP-1 response appears to stimulate earlier, more efficient insulin release from your pancreas, meaning your body is better prepared to handle the incoming glucose by the time it actually arrives in your bloodstream, rather than reacting to it after the fact. I want to share the actual research with you, because I think it makes this much more convincing than simply taking my word for it. Studies using continuous glucose monitoring have directly compared identical meals eaten in different orders, vegetables and protein first versus carbohydrates first, in the same individuals. The results have consistently shown significantly lower post-meal blood sugar spikes when vegetables and protein preceded the carbohydrate portion of the meal, in some studies by a substantial margin, even though every other aspect of the meal, total calories, total carbohydrate content, remain completely identical. Here's exactly how I'd recommend implementing this practically, starting with your very next meal. When your plate arrives or when you sit down to eat, start with your vegetables. Eat those first, taking a few minutes if the meal allows for it. Then move to your protein, meat, fish, eggs, tofu, whatever your protein source happens to be that meal. Save your starch or carbohydrate portion, rice, bread, pasta, potatoes, for last, ideally eating it at least 10 to 15 minutes after you started the vegetables and protein, if your meal timing allows for that kind of pacing. I recognize this isn't always practical. A quick lunch break, a meal where everything's already mixed together like a stir fry, and that's completely fine. Even a rough approximation, being mindful to eat more of your vegetables and protein early in the meal rather than saving them for last, provides meaningful benefit, even without perfect, rigid sequencing. My tip for patients starting this habit, and something I genuinely find helps with adherence, is simply rearranging your plate mentally before you start eating, identifying which portion is your vegetable and protein and which is your starch. So you're making a conscious choice about sequence, rather than eating however feels most natural or habitual in the moment. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond just that single meal's blood sugar reading, because I want you to understand the bigger picture here, not just the immediate mechanism. Repeated, large blood sugar spikes, meal after meal, contribute to something called glycemic variability, and research has increasingly connected high glycemic variability, independent of your average blood sugar level, to increased oxidative stress and inflammation throughout your cardiovascular system. This means the eating order habit isn't just about smoothing out one meal. It's a tool for reducing the cumulative, repeated stress that sharp glucose spikes place on your blood vessels and metabolic system over months and years. Let's talk about who this matters most for, because I want to be clinically honest with you about where the evidence is strongest. This technique has been most extensively studied in people with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, where the blood sugar benefit tends to be most pronounced, simply because the baseline glucose response in these individuals tends to be larger and more variable to begin with. That said, the underlying mechanism applies to essentially everyone, and even people with completely normal glucose metabolism show a measurable, if smaller, benefit from this same approach. Now, if you're finding this useful, this is exactly the kind of practical, mechanism-based advice I like sharing on this channel, the kind of explanation I wish more patients received in a typical appointment, where time is often limited. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe because there's more of this coming. Let's talk about a related strategy that pairs well with eating order, and that's the 10 to 15-minute walk after a meal, particularly the carbohydrate-containing portion. When your muscles are actively contracting during walking, they can pull glucose directly from your bloodstream through a pathway that doesn't require much insulin at all, complementing the eating order strategy by addressing the glucose that does make it into your bloodstream through a completely separate mechanism. Let's talk about vinegar too, since this is another tool that works alongside eating order rather than replacing it. Consuming about 1 tablespoon of vinegar, diluted in water, shortly before a carbohydrate-containing meal has been shown in research to further blunt the resulting glucose spike through a somewhat different mechanism involving slowed starch digestion. Combining this with proper eating order provides 2 complementary layers of blood sugar management from the same meal. Let's talk about consistency in meal timing too, since eating at wildly irregular times can itself contribute to glucose variability, independent of eating order or food choice. Aiming for relatively consistent meal timing day to day supports more predictable, stable blood sugar patterns overall, working alongside everything else we've discussed today. Let's talk about sleep and stress too, since I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't mention them in this context. Poor sleep has been shown in controlled research to reduce insulin sensitivity within just a single night of restriction, meaning even a perfectly executed eating order strategy is working against a somewhat compromised baseline on days following inadequate sleep. Chronic stress similarly affects blood sugar regulation through elevated cortisol. Neither of these negates the value of the eating order technique, but they're worth addressing as part of a comprehensive approach, rather than expecting one single strategy to fully offset poor sleep or unmanaged stress. Let's talk timeline, because I always want to give my patients an honest, realistic picture. The blood sugar benefit from eating order is something you can genuinely measure within that very same meal, if you happen to have a continuous glucose monitor or check your blood sugar at home. It's not a habit that requires weeks to show effect. The mechanism works immediately, meal to meal. The longer-term benefit, reduced glycemic variability, and for some patients, improved markers like hemoglobin A1C over months, builds with consistent practice across most or all of your meals, not just occasional use. Let me answer a few questions patients frequently ask me about this. First, does this actually work if I have a mixed meal, like a stir-fry or a casserole, where everything is already combined? The core principle still applies as best you can approximate it. Try to eat the vegetable and protein pieces of the dish somewhat preferentially in the early portion of the meal if you can identify them, and save the rice or noodle portion for slightly later. It won't be as clean a separation as a plate with distinct components, but even a rough approximation provides some benefit. Second, is this technique meant to replace my diabetes medication if I have type 2 diabetes? Absolutely not. And please never adjust or stop any prescribed medication without discussing it with your doctor directly. This technique is a complementary strategy that can meaningfully support your overall blood sugar management alongside whatever treatment plan you and your doctor have established, not a replacement for it. Third, Do I need to wait a full 15 minutes between vegetables and carbohydrates every single time, even for a quick meal? Ideally, yes, for the strongest effect based on the research, but any delay, even just a few minutes, or simply prioritizing vegetable and protein bites earlier in a meal you're eating more quickly, still provides meaningful benefit over eating carbohydrates first or all mixed together without any intentional sequencing at all. So here's what I want you to take away from our conversation today. This was never just about which foods are good or bad. It's about a specific, well-documented physiological sequence, fiber slowing absorption, protein triggering GLP-1 release, slower gastric emptying, that your body responds to differently based purely on the order you eat the exact same foods. This is one of the few interventions in nutrition where you're not being asked to eat less or eliminate foods you enjoy, simply to sequence them more thoughtfully. Combine this eating order strategy with a short walk after meals, consistent meal timing, and attention to sleep and stress, and you're giving your body genuinely comprehensive support for stable, healthy blood sugar, working with your own physiology rather than against it. If you found this helpful, my next video breaks down exactly what continuous glucose monitors reveal about hidden blood sugar spikes most people never realize they're having, even without a diabetes diagnosis. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.